homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Welcome back, young friends, to another short session that accompanies the Buddha's gradual instructions on virtue, sīlakathaṁ. So today we're looking at the story of Chunda the pork butcher. So this is a story that accompanies one of the sayings of the Buddha in the Dhammapada. So there's this story about Chunda, so that's his name, and he's a butcher, a pig butcher or pork butcher. And he lives near Veluvana Monastery in Rajagaha. So there's a little village, and he was known to be very cruel and not very kind at all, very hard-hearted. So not warm-hearted, but hard-hearted. And he'd been a pork butcher for over 55 years. And during that time, he didn't do any kind of dana, no generous act, no meritorious activity at all. So just before he passed away, just before he died, he was in a great deal of pain and agony. So a lot of physical pain. He was apparently grunting and squealing and yelling out in pain. He kept moving around on his hands and knees. And it said that he was like a pig, moving around and squealing basically. So he did that for 7 whole days before he eventually passed away. And he was suffering as if he was already in one of the hell realms. So on the 7th day that he died, this is what the Buddha is saying, on the 7th day that he died, he was reborn in one of the worst hells. So this is the really lowest of low hells, and it was called the Avicii Naraya. So what is said about this story is that when you do bad deeds, like evil deeds such as killing, then you have to suffer for those evil deeds. So this is the karma that you have to bear with, you have to endure. And so you suffer in this world. So before he died, he suffered. And after death, he also suffered as well in the next world that he was reborn into. And so what Buddha says is that he gave this particular saying, here he grieves, following death he grieves, in both states the evildoer grieves. He grieves, he is afflicted, having seen the impurity or the stain of his actions. So what the Buddha is explaining here, and of course, this is not a very pleasant thing to talk about, but it's gravely important. It's really, really important for us to understand the results of our actions. That when we're doing certain things, and in this case, we're talking about killing. When we talk about killing, sometimes we get very desensitized from it. Or sometimes we think, oh, we don't do those things. But Buddha teaches very straight. He's a very straight teacher. He says it like it is. He doesn't hold back. And so despite this being a story which is quite uncomfortable and quite difficult to listen to, particularly to hear someone who's done bad actions, bad livelihood, and to even hear them suffer, we don't like to hear that. We don't like to know that they ended up in a bad place. And even when we look at the people around us, sometimes we do see them do really bad things, whether we see it on TV, on the news and things, and really you know that the result will be quite bad for them, particularly if you understand the Buddha's teachings. And so we don't shy away from listening to this kind of Dhamma because it wakes us up. It makes us think about it. What would I do if I have such a job? The story about Chunda, the pork butcher, really makes you think, particularly if you're young. What kind of job should I do? So Buddha does talk about not doing, jobs such as killing living beings, killing humans, trafficking humans, dealing in alcohol, all those kinds of things. And so there's a reason for it, because Buddha's always warning, think first, think about what is the repercussion. So when it comes to this pork butcher, it's probably one of the most visual ones that you get when Buddha explains it. And of course, Buddha is also telling us about the hell realms, that it's not something to be taken lightly, that karma is very real. If you have right view, then you really understand Buddha's actually trying to warn us. Be very careful what you do. Your actions are very important. What you decide, your intention behind your actions is very important. So in the case of Chunda the Buddha, what's clear about his story is that he was a cruel person. He didn't feel that he was doing anything wrong. That's what it sounds like. And he was quite happy to inflict pain on animals. So when you have that kind of attitude, like when we're looking at the precept of killing, that when you really understand about killing and the pain that you inflict, then you know if you turn that on yourself, would you like someone to do that to you? Then the answer is no. And so just before he died, Chunda was experiencing what it would like to be, what it would be like to be like a pig, and experience some aspect of the pain. And then when he was reborn in the hell realms, he would have experienced a lot of what he would have had inflicted on pigs being reborn into the hell realm. When we look at right livelihood, which we will look at towards the end of this series, when we look at the Noble Eightfold Path, right livelihood is something that's so important in walking the Noble Eightfold Path. So if you have wrong livelihood, it makes it very, very difficult. So for example, if you were similar to Chunda the poor butcher, then you would be having a lot of difficulty in walking the Noble Eightfold Path. But also, once you realize the severity and the ramifications, the bad results of your action, you would have a lot of remorse. You would regret once you realize. So Buddha talks about in the Kandaraka Sutta, this is a middle-length teaching, and the Buddha says, what kind of person torments others and pursues the practice of torturing others? So Buddha is very graphic here. When you do livelihood that torments others, like hurts others, inflicts pain on others, so that means you're torturing them. There are certain kinds of jobs that one can do, or certain kinds of activities, or even sometimes people take them as hobbies. So here Buddha talks about the butcher of animals, so sheep, pigs, poultry, a trapper of wild beasts. So if you go out into the forest and you lay traps for wild pigs, for deer, for all kinds of wild animals, then that's also quite bad. It's very unskillful. Same with hunters, if you go out and you enjoy shooting animals. And the same thing when it comes to being an executioner, even a thief who would harm someone and inflict pain, that's also quite bad. A fisherman, so when you're fishing for sea life, sea creatures, whether it's fish or prawns or lobsters, sometimes people are numb to the life that these creatures live. They may have families and groups and other things, and it's quite painful when you catch them. And same when it comes to if you're a prison warden or executioner. These are what Buddha calls cruel livelihoods. And so a person who inflicts such pain, mortifies others, and inflicts that kind of pain, it's quite an awful thing, and you would suffer the results of inflicting such pain. So one of the things that the Buddha talks about is really understanding death and the process of being hurt and dying. That when you really reflect as part of the precept of not killing, you really start to understand that there's more to it than that. And so we're going to look at that a little bit further. One of the key things that the Buddha teaches begins with right view. So you hear that a lot. Right view is the forerunner. So that means it directs how we develop any path and practice in accordance with the Buddha's teaching. So when Buddha talks about right view, Buddha talks about understanding dukkha, understanding suffering. Now, one aspect about understanding suffering is about understanding death. And so there's a series of questions that we ask when we contemplate death. And this is something that people don't often talk about because nobody really likes to talk about death, and that's understandable because it's quite painful. But when you really, really look at it, and this is what I mean about Buddha being a very straight teacher, he tells it like it is. He doesn't shy away from the hard subjects. Because if you really think about what the world tells us, they always tell us that death is a certainty. When we are born, we are bound for death. We're connected to death, irrevocably connected to death. And so this is something that it should be okay to talk about, because whether we're young, whether we're middle-aged, whether we're old, it's something we need to know about. So there's a number of questions that we ask ourselves when it comes to death, so we understand why we keep the precept of not killing. So we ask ourselves, do we truly understand the pain and suffering of hurting others? Now, when we understand how much it is that we don't want others to hurt us, that we don't want to be killed, then we start to understand what it's like to inflict pain or suffering on others. So for the person that goes out hunting and killing, they don't really think about if that was to happen to them. Like as they're killing animals or trapping or going out fishing, they don't really think about what it's like to be the fish or the deer that's being hunted or the fowl that is being shot, as a sport. They don't really think about it. But if they were to turn that around and think about, okay, if I am that fish, if I am that wild boar, if I am that deer that is running and hoping not to be caught by the hunter, and that could be human hunter or could be even animal hunter, then you realize, well, you would have a deeper understanding about pain and suffering that comes with hurting someone else. And so that's the first question. The second question is, do we truly understand pain and suffering of death itself? And that's a very difficult one because, we're alive. We don't have that experience. And maybe we do see on the television sometimes stories of someone, we see someone dying, like an actor acting out that process, whether it's in war or whether it's a crime that's been committed or something like that. Or even we read about it from history books and things about people coming to really tragic deaths. Or maybe we're traveling on the road and we see a road accident and we see what that's like. But it's important to really think about that, because when we do know about it, then we don't want to inflict that on anybody else. It's quite painful, it's quite severe, it's quite shocking and quite immediate. It happens very quickly at times, or it can be within a matter of hours, depending on what has happened. But then the third question you ask is, do we truly understand the hurt and grief of families and groups when they mourn the death of their loved ones? So when it comes to even pets get run over in car accidents, that people may be drunk driving, or it could be a person, or even this hunting thing, or even in war. Do we stop and think about what happens to families? So if we've ever lost someone to something tragic, we know how shocking, how devastating it is. And the devastation and the despair is very, very real. So when you understand that death doesn't just have the direct impact to the person or the being or the animal that is killed, it also affects their loved ones. The people or the animal families around them, they mourn, they suffer, they go into despair. And so you really look at that and you understand actually death has no boundaries in terms of the pain and suffering it inflicts. And then the fourth question, and there may be more questions than this, is you ask, do we truly understand the bad results of killing living beings? So when you hear the story of the Buddha, and there are many other suttas where the Buddha talks about stories about killing, you actually see, well, actually, the results can be really, really dire. So there's a number of suttas. There's one called the Balapandita Sutta about fools and the wise, and Buddha goes into quite grim stories about the bad results. And there are other ones as well that are also there. If you think about when we read and we watch different stories and movies and TV programs that show a lot of killing, we should be okay with reading suttas that give us the truth. So oftentimes when you watch movies and TV programs and our parents tell us, oh, don't watch those things, or read books that are particularly violent and everything, don't read those things. Well, we should be reading instead the Buddha's teachings about these things, because they're offering us a real glimpse of the truth. And so when you read these stories about the really bad results that happen, that you end up in all these different kinds of hells, if you inflict so much pain by your actions, then it's a really good thing to know. And one should really thank someone who tells you that, whether it's a friend or a teacher or the Buddha, the noble ones. You're really grateful because they're warning you from danger. And when you revisit the words of Chunda's story, the pig butcher, the pork butcher, and you hear how much pain that he inflicted and how much pain he had as a result, then someone is really warning you from having that kind of scenario play out. That after you pass away, if you've done such awful things and you correct it now, then that someone is saving you. And so we should always be grateful when someone warns us from breaking precepts, trying to help us out. Now, it's not always easy. We can't always help everyone, but it's something to bear in mind that these are difficult topics. But if we don't talk about them, then we end up in really bad situations later on. And the final thing we can talk about is really about how we can protect our mind. And so when you're young, your parents protect your mind by saying, don't watch that, you can't have that, you can't play that, we won't let you read that. And really we should be grateful for our parents when we do that, because they know more than us, particularly when we're young, because they know the danger of watching it. They see it in their own minds, having watched it themselves. But as we get older, we want to be able to choose wisely for ourselves. So we covered a little bit of this when we went through the main session on sīlakathaṁ, so Buddha's instructions on virtue, about protecting the mind, that we don't want the mind to be unprotected. We don't want the mind, if it escalates, to become corrupt. And eventually we don't want the mind to be rotten. So the Buddha gave the simile about a roof, that you need to maintain and make sure the roof is always repaired, so the water doesn't go in and damage the roof and eventually make the roof rotten. So similarly with our minds, we want to do the same thing. So if you remember that from our main session. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this particular aspect, because it's really, really important that we learn how to protect our mind. So at the moment, what you find in the past few decades, like if you're an adult, you'll know this. In the past few decades, what we see on the TV, what we see through the internet and through social media is a lot of violence and a lot of sexual activity and a lot of things associated with stealing and a lot of things that really make the mind quite agitated. Makes the mind either angry or makes the mind fearful, paranoid, all kinds of things. It also makes the mind very argumentative. You get very polarized. And polarized means you either really, really like something or really, really hate something. So when you see on the news or you see through the internet people arguing, people having very, very strong differences of opinions, that's coming from what we watch, what we read, and what we do with our minds. And when you look at the way music has evolved, music as different music genres, they become quite violent, they become quite divisive as well, particularly when you pay attention to lyrics. They make you think about things in particular ways, whether you know it or not. So one of the things that's really important as we grow up, as we develop our minds, is to make sure we don't put our minds in the wrong areas. So this is with the TV. We need to be very selective. Think about the TV as a portal to either wholesome or unwholesome. So if you just turn on the TV and you don't exercise care and caution like your parents would do, then really you're opening it up to allowing the TV to influence how you think, knowingly or unknowingly, and mostly unknowingly. It's like walking into an arena and you don't know whether a monster, like a big beast, is going to come out and attack you, or whether it's going to be a pussycat, like a little kitten or a little puppy. And so that's like what it's like when you turn on the TV, that you don't know what's going to come at you. And so when you turn on the TV, you need to be very, very careful. Same with Netflix, same with all these different people or companies that are trying to distribute all kinds of things. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that what they normally show you are things that are addictive, that once you start watching a particular series, you're hooked. And people that practice the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, they don't like to be hooked to anything that is unwholesome. And so they don't start watching TV series because they know that it becomes quite addictive and you can't stop watching. So when you talk to very serious practitioners, they're very careful not to get addicted to TV series, not to get addicted to wrong kinds of programs that are about violence, about killing, glorifying killing, make it cool to be killing, make it cool to be stealing, make it cool to be cheating on your partner and breaking up families, that glorify harsh speech, shouting and yelling and being mean to people, about divisive speech, inciting violence, inciting all kinds of wrong kinds of conduct through your speech, encouraging lying, encouraging empty talk. So the thing to bear in mind is not to develop habits that are particularly unwholesome, because as the Buddha says, it becomes corrupt and then it becomes severely rotten, where you can't easily turn back from it. And same with books, you can become addicted to books that are a series of stories. And particularly the ones to bear in mind are the ones that are about serial killers and violent crimes and sexual misconduct and racy novels that really increase greed, hatred and delusion. I think what it is everything about increasing greed, hatred and delusion, because the danger is that you can't come out of it. Once you start listening to things, watching things, reading things that you think you like, it's very hard to come out of it. And you start despairing when you walk the Buddha's path, thinking, I really don't want to give it up. But when you're young, if you don't start, then you won't know the difference. And so I'm not going to name certain things, because if I name certain things, you'll want to go and look. And that's not the point of it. And sometimes when you read the newspapers or you see the advertising, they tell you, oh, this is being banned, this is being censored. Sometimes they do that as reverse psychology. You get interested in, oh, what is it they're going to ban? So you want to go and look, and then you get addicted. It's reverse psychology. And you get hooked. So it's dangerous. And when it comes to video games, and we're going from simply the Nintendo and all the other names of it, I don't even know what they are, so I can't name them. Xbox, I think another one is called. But we're moving towards virtual reality. I just want to say that when you're young, people that develop technology, they want to put it in your hands very, very early. And it may seem very cool to have all these things. So now we're moving into wearables. So wearables in terms of virtual reality. So we're going from things which you play in terms of gadgets to things that you wear. And it's going to get more sophisticated than that. And if you don't have them, so if you're at school or university or with your friends and you don't have them, you feel like you're missing out, or you feel like, oh, people are going to judge me because I don't have them. But I think one of the things to bear in mind is, don't be the first one to test it out. Wait and see what's the result. So with social media, there's a lot of reports through universities that it is bad for us. And many of us know, because it becomes like an envy portal. People envy each other by looking at, people normally post the best of what they've done. In the past, it would have been all the places that they visited and all the adventurous things that they've done, sometimes dangerous. And so you end up envying the things that they've bought, the things that they've experienced. And nobody likes that. You end up feeling quite low. And that's why social media people realize now that things like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, they make people feel quite bad at times, because what people post is not really the truth. It's the fiction of it. And sometimes there's some truth in it, but most of the time it's the the gloss of it, it's the shine. But we know ourselves that life isn't like that. It has its ups and downs, and the reality is often not so shiny. So when it comes to technology and games, don't be the first one to test it out. Wait, and also check whether it's really good for us. So a lot of the games that have been formed are very violent. So I don't know all the games, but maybe one of them is about Worlds of War or something, or maybe something like that. So I don't know what they are. I don't wish to play them myself. But when you play these games, you're simulating killing. So every time you shoot the gun, every time you blow up something in those games, you're simulating killing. And so when you feel very happy from the game, because the game makes you want to get points or feel like you've won in a competitive sense, then it's not a good thing. Buddha would not say that's a good thing, because you're simulating killing and you're enjoying killing. And that is something that is very bad. The result is bad. So when we move to virtual reality, it's the same thing. You're simulating it, but you're even closer to it now because you're actually in the game itself. So when you find that Buddha is saying don't have livelihoods that kill humans, so the military, don't kill animals, which is butchering, or even having hobbies like that. When you have games that simulate killing, it's really, really important to know what you're doing. You are actually killing. And you may think, oh, it's simply a game. But there are repercussions. It can actually seep out into your life, because eventually you think, well, maybe it's okay to have an unskillful livelihood. Or maybe later on you think it's okay to do various things that involve killing, defending yourself, taking arms, all sorts of stuff. Now there are people that would have very different views, but all we're doing is we're following the Buddha's view. If you take refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha and you understand the Buddha's teachings on karma, you understand what Buddha means by the bad result, then you're more careful. So this is something to think about, to contemplate, to talk to your parents about, to talk to your friends about, to look at the things that we do in our lives that also extend when it comes to our virtue. And so I think this is something that's important to raise and not to shy away from, because the more you go into it, the more you start to protect. And as we develop further, thinking that developing these technologies are good and it has its place, but if it encourages us to break our precepts, then there's something very important to think about and to choose wisely and to restrain. Restrain is actually a sukhabhagya. Buddha talks about it being associated with happiness. So when you refrain from video games that are around killing, you actually have more happiness, because although you might get the excitement of killing, what happens with your sleep? What happens with how you deal with people? How quick are you to anger when you're with friends after playing these games? Just observe it. Think about it. And if you find that it is not good, then maybe you actually need to abandon these games which are inevitably bad for you. So rather than tell you what to do, I would offer strong encouragement to really look at it, to really take the Buddha's teachings to heart. And if you're older, to really choose wisely, to look at the effect of it, to look at what will happen as the end result. We can finish off our discussion by going back to the Arakkhita Sutta. So this is the simile of the roof and how we protect our mind through our physical, verbal and mental actions. So if we read the Buddha's words, the Buddha says, just as when a peaked roofed house is well roofed, the peak of the roof is protected, the roof beams are protected, the walls are protected. And therefore the peak of the roof beams, the walls, they don't get soggy. And therefore the peak of the roof beams and the walls don't rot, so they don't get rotten. In the same way, when the mind is protected, bodily actions, verbal actions and mental actions are protected as well. And when those are protected, then those don't get soggy so we don't get corrupt. And when our bodily, verbal and mental actions don't rot, then what happens is our death is auspicious and the mode of one's dying is good. So basically that means on the mundane path we ascend upwards, we go to a good destination because we live a life that is pure, that is non-harmful and not hurtful. And we don't cause suffering or inflict pain on anybody else. And one of the things is that we won't have a fear of death in the way that we die, because most of us, what happens when we are unskillful and we have unwholesome actions, there is a fear of dying because we have inflicted pain and suffering, tormented other beings. And when that's the case, you are concerned, you do worry. And so when you've actually corrected all that, you've actually protected the mind and therefore protected your conduct through body, speech and mind, then what happens is that you don't have those fears. You know that one is pure, that there aren't any stains that you need to look at. And so that's what Buddha means, that one's death is auspicious and one's mode of dying is also good. And if you develop the path further, then of course there is also Nibbana, that you are completely out of all pain and suffering. And that is the ultimate goal of the Buddha's path.